I know last week I said I'm going to talk briefly about what it means to be a believer. Then I looked at the video afterwards and it went to like 40 minutes. I apologize if that wasn't briefly for those of you who were here. This evening I will be a little bit more brief, maybe not quite as long as last time. And you've often maybe heard me talking about the ancient nation of Israel. And perhaps I have mentioned it before as well. But I find as Christians we have sometimes a bit of an obscure view of Israel. What does Israel mean to us today? Does it mean anything to us today? Especially Israel in the Old Testament. We sometimes forget that the story actually started with Adam and then Noah, and then Abram got involved, and then Joseph got involved somewhere, and then there's a guy called Moses. Then we had all the prophets. What does this mean? Who were the people of Israel? How many of you know that Jesus was a Jew? Do you know Jesus was a Jew? He was a Jew. He was, of course, a descendant of King David, who is another figure of the ancient nation of Israel, and from the tribe of Judah, which is also a very significant and specific tribe. So all of those things we'll cover. I'm going to do a series on this, but this evening I want to start at the very beginning of the ancient nation of Israel. But before we get there, how many of you know about that tiny little country in the Middle East today called Israel? I think it's called, the full name is, I've gone blank now. It's got a full name. It's not the Republic of Israel, but there's a full name. The State of Israel. It's called the State of Israel, which I think is quite significant. You know, when they first formed, they tried to be very secular. Obviously, that was very difficult because it's a state, a homeland for Jewish people. But the actual government of the state tried to be very secular in their whole setting up. But I find it significant that it's called the State of Israel. Because what's a state? I mean, you could think of a nation, but it's a state of being for one, you know. We are in a state here, hopefully not a hysterical state or a bored state, maybe later on. But what about that? Are they there because God said they could go there? Or are they there because they're stealing land from the Palestinians? Like I said, unfortunately, due to our modern Christian perspective on things, we often forget or don't know about things from the Old Testament. And it shouldn't be called the Old Testament and we have the New Testament. Okay, that's old, let's forget about it. The scholars prefer sometimes to call it the Hebrew Bible, because Old Testament and New Testament, sometimes we think, okay, it's old, let's put it off, we're in the New Testament now. But it's just as significant as the New Testament. For if we didn't have the Old Testament, if we didn't have the Hebrew Bible, if we didn't have the ancient nation of Israel, we wouldn't be where we are today. Some people think the church has replaced Israel. I think that's called dispensationalism. I might be incorrect on that. But some people believe the church, as in the body of believers, has replaced God's promises to Israel and God's plans and purposes for Israel. But I don't think that's the case. I think He's made eternal promises to a very specific group of people. And after 2,000 years, in 1948, we saw that they came back to their homeland after being exiled and away for 2,000 years. And I don't think that's because of any work of the United Nations or any work of the foreign minister Balfour, who made a declaration in 1917, but I think that's because of God's eternal promises to the nation of Israel. Although that's not the nation of Israel that we're going to look at in the Bible. So I want to start at the very beginning and the call of Abram. And I know Pastor Paul covered this in his biblical narrative some time ago, but I want to look at it from the perspective of Israel as a nation, as a specific people, what this meant to them, and more importantly, what it means to us today. And we'll see just how there is a progression and a transferal, but not necessarily a replacement of Israel, but how it is relevant to us today. So there we can see is Canaan, the land of Canaan. And this was the very beginning. There was nothing there except pagan people called the Canaanites and the Jebusites and the Girgashites and the Ammonites and all the other funny knights we read about in the Bible. They kind of all occupied that space. And beyond that big river over there, that's the Euphrates, we had Mesopotamia. And in Mesopotamia we had the land of Ur, which is where Abram came from. We had the ancient nation of Babylon, which kind of represented the whole, pagan institution in the world. So this is the very beginning. This is how it starts. And I'm going to read from Genesis 12, verse 1 to 9. And if you want to follow, it will be on the screen. Otherwise, if you're very quick with your Bible, go. Okay. No one wants their Bibles out. The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be, a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went. Let's say that together. Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. That sounds quite bad. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. That's significant, to your offspring. Now we read in the New Testament that the Gentiles have been grafted in to Abram's offspring because of Jesus Christ. But here he's talking about a very specific offspring, as in descendants, as in bloodline. And we know that Abram was fatherless at this stage, and he was 75 years old. Verse 8, from there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued towards the Negev. Some translations will say the Negeb, and that's towards the south. Like I said, these names are significant. We might not know where Bethel or where Ai is or where Haran is, but all of this meant something to the original readers, and that's what we need to try to understand. Here we see God choosing and calling Abram. Abram meaning the exalted father. The exalted father, who later becomes Abraham. What does Abraham mean? Who knows? The father of many. So the exalted father becomes the father of many. And we'll see how that is significant now. Like I said, names are important in the Bible. And God promises him a great nation. He promises him blessings, a reputation, and to be a blessing to others. But to achieve this, Abram had to go to the land that God would show him. Abram had to take action. So there is an obedience condition to these blessings. And notice the clarifications and contrasts here as well. At this time, the Canaanites were in the land. Moses makes this very clear when he's writing. The Canaanites were in the land. And that's because the people who are reading this initially would have been Israelites in the land, who would have, maybe not been in the conquest of Joshua and all that, but they would have been living in the promised land and reading how their people became a people and how they got here. So all these kinds of things I want us to think about as we are going through this passage of Scripture. We need to try understand all of this from the perspective of the ancient Israelites. And there are three aspects to the story that I want to look at that I think are significant, and we'll see how they apply to us today. And the first one is that of the character of Abram. Abram, like I said, means the exalted father. Important to note, Abram's family were not Jews. There were no Jews, there were no Hebrews at this time. They were pagans living in Haran, or the land of Ur. And there's a story, I don't know if you've heard about it, but Abraham was a faithful man. That's why God chose him. And this isn't fact, historical fact, but it's a tradition amongst the Jews, that Abram's father was an idol maker. I don't know if you've heard this. Abram's father was an idol maker, and he went out one day to go and do some business, and Abram was left at home. So what he did was he took the biggest idol he could find, and he put it in the center of the room, and he took all the other little idols and placed it around. Then he smashed all the little idols and put the hammer in the big idol's hand. And when his father came, he said, "What have you done? Why have you smashed all these idols?" And Abram said, "It wasn't me, it was this big daddy idol over here. He smashed all of them." So his father says, "Don't be silly, man. How can that statue smash all the other ones?" Abram said, "Exactly. How can idols do anything?" So Abraham was a faithful man, and he was set apart for the sole reason that he was faithful to Yahweh in a pagan world. God revealed himself to Abram because he was faithful in a pagan world. Hence he was not to be a father in that he would be the head. He was to be a father in that he would be the head of a new people who would be faithful to God. Almost like the leader of a congregation. If you want to start a church somewhere, you really have to work it. I mean, I don't have any experience with that, but just from reading things and that, it's quite a schlep because you have to raise money for the building, you have to go out and get people involved, and you have to keep them involved. So he was to begin this pattern of faithfulness in a new people because he was faithful. And later on, God changes his name to Abraham, which means the father of many. And that's a numerical significance. He's going to be the father of many children. Now we know he had Isaac, and Isaac had Jacob, and then he had the 12 sons and everything. So it wasn't Abraham's direct children, but the father of many children. And we sing that song, "Father Abraham had many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them." Why are we one of them? Because we've been grafted in because of Jesus Christ. Why would that be significant if God didn't keep his promises to Abraham and his descendants? Why would it be significant for Paul to write that we have been grafted in if Israel meant nothing? So we'll get to all of that in this series. But like I want to say, names are significant. Abraham was the exalted father, exalted as in set apart, put above. The exalted father would become the father of many. So God was going to pull a nation out and exalt a nation and make it into a great and prosperous one. But we need to look at a bit of his background. So if we go to Joshua 24:2-3, we see Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abram, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods." They served other gods. "Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants, and gave him Isaac." The river in question here is talking about the Euphrates River, beyond which, like I said, lay Babylon, and that was the epitome of pagan worship. So God pulled Abraham, the exalted father, the beginning of the Israelite nation. He took him from beyond the river to this side of the river. He brought him out of the pagan world into his love, into his goodness, into his system of doing things, his moral code. And that was because of his grace. It wasn't because of anything Abram did. He was faithful, but it's because God chose to pull him out of the pagan world. And from the beginning, we can see God's goodness on display. Right from the very beginning, we can see God's goodness on display to Abram and by extension the nation of Israel. And Paul says this, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath." Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. But, this is a wonderful but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. This is what was at work in the life of Abram when God called him. This was Abram, who might have been faithful, but who was dead in the pagan world, who was lost, through whom a whole nation came to being, a Messiah, blessed to the world. This one man was lost in the pagan world, and because of God's great love, because of God's mercy, because of God's initiative, he pulled him from beyond the river. He pulled him out of the pagan land. Abraham was chosen by grace, and he was made alive through circumcision, or the law, the mark of the law, which was God giving to him a moral code, God giving him standards for living. This is what you need to do to live. Don't live like the pagans. My way is better. Don't do this. My way is better. And we look at all the specifics that we can find in Leviticus and the rest of the law. But it was more than that. And the whole heart of the law, as Jesus summed up for us, is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the essence of God's way. That is the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. God, like I said, took Abram out of the pagan world, from beyond the river, and brought him into this new place, into this new dispensation. A promised land, but also a promised system, a promised moral code, a promised family, a promised relationship, a promised covenant with him. Now in Christ we know we have circumcision of our hearts. We don't have to follow the law, in that we don't have to do all the animal sacrifice and things like that, because Jesus is the greatest sacrifice. But the point is still the same. The continuation is still there. There is a connection. But like I said, we're not focusing on the Christian perspective. We're still with Abram at this stage. And so Abraham, or by extension the whole of Israel, was called by God's grace alone, like I said. We can sum Abram in the character of Abram like this. Israel was chosen to stand out amongst the idolatrous nations. That's what we see from the beginning in the person of Abram. So if the only thing you remember tonight about the nation of Israel from the Old Testament is that it was chosen to stand out amongst the idolatrous nations. Israel was chosen to be set apart. And why? Because they were to be a holy nation. A nation of priests who would be a witness to the earth. And ultimately, the people through whom we have Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And it was all because of God's grace. All because of God's initiative. And this is something we need to remember. Nothing we can do, nothing we can say, nothing we can think, nothing we can feel is going to bring us any closer to God other than His grace. And the only way we can have His grace is through submission, through laying down ourselves, getting rid of that ugly stuff in our hearts, putting that aside, because we can only operate in His grace. And that's what we see right from the very beginning of the nation of Israel. And why did they fall? Why did they keep falling? Why did they keep stumbling? Because they didn't operate in His grace. Because they didn't want to operate in His mercy. They thought they knew better. They built the golden calf. Oh, we need something to worship. Let's get all these wonderful pieces of jewelry, melt them down, build this big, beautiful cow and bow down to it. I mean, if you love meat and steak and stuff, maybe it's not such a bad thing if it was a living cow. No, I'm joking. Don't bow down to anything. But this is a statue. This is the very thing from which God called Abram out of. God pulled him out of that idolatrous stuff. And in the desert, they go straight back to it. God just saved them from Egypt. The Exodus, He pulled them out of this idolatrous land in Egypt again. Started with Him pulling Abram from that world. Then they went down to Egypt, and God pulled the whole nation out of Egypt. And then they just go back and bow down to the golden calf. How often do we do that? How often are we stuck? How often are we don't know what to do? We've got no options. We've got nowhere to turn. except to God, but we don't turn to God. We make a golden calf and bow down to it. And yet it's all because of God's grace. Next thing I look at is the aspect of blessings. God promises Abram blessings if he was to go to the promised land. He promises him blessings, not only salvation from the pagan world, but blessings for doing so. A blessings upon the nation, a great name amongst the other nations, and blessings to the other nations if they were to bless Israel. Great nation numerically for fatherless Abram, which must have been quite I've got no children now, God's promising me to have, as many as the stars in the sky. But also, so not only numerically, but also in might and prosperity. Israel was, if they obeyed God, they would have stood out, not only ethically and morally, but also they would have been strong, they would have been prosperous. That's what the plan was, if they were to obey God. And although there is no if, it is implied. There is no if, but it is implied. God tells Abram to leave and to follow him to the new land, and he will bless him. If Abram did not leave his land, there would be no blessings. Firstly, because he was not being obedient. So if he didn't leave the pagan world, he wouldn't have blessings because he wasn't being obedient. But secondly, he would still be living a poor quality pagan life. This is where we need to start understanding it from an ancient perspective. People were living badly. People were sacrificing their children. People were eating dodgy things and getting sick and dying. People were slaughtering each other. People didn't have a moral code or a law by which to judge, the behavior of other people. It was reckless, and it was a dog-eat-dog world. And so, for Abraham to experience blessings, he had to be obedient. And he had to leave the land for the blessings, but also to live a proper life, because God had a better plan for him. And that's the other thing we need to think about. When God calls us, we need to be obedient, but we also need to remember He's got a better plan. We might think we know. We might think that new job might be better for us. We might think moving to a new place might be better for us. We might think that investment strategy might be good for us. We might think that friendship group might be good for us. But if it doesn't work out, and we keep trying, it's not working, maybe we need to stop and reevaluate. Because God's always got a better plan. Amen? God's always got a better plan and a better thing in store for you. Like I said, you had to be obedient. How many of you like chilies and hot food? I like hot food. How many of you like what happens a couple hours after eating hot food? When your tummy starts going, like, ooh. Some of us, it's a little bit easier, but some of us, we know we've got 20 seconds. Some even less than that. That's obedience. That's the kind of obedience Abraham had. He didn't wait. He got up and he left. And just like with chilies, if you don't get up and you leave, you're going to have a problem. When your eye starts twitching a little bit, then you know it's getting bad as well. But that's the kind of obedience we need to have. That's the kind of obedience. I'm losing you. That's the kind of obedience we need to have. That urgency to get up and go. Deuteronomy 18:9. Moses writes this: when you come into the land the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. You shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. Why? Like I said, they were sacrificing their children. They were eating pigs and getting sick. All of that is practical. All of that has a purpose in the law. And they needed to have a better quality life. For example, let's look at this. There are some that only chew the cud or only have a divided hoof, but you must not eat them. The camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is ceremonially unclean for you. The hyrax, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. That's a dussie. Some translations say rock badger, it's a dussie. You know those little rodent things. It chews the cud, but it does not have a divided hoof. I think it has a paw, actually. It is unclean for you. The rabbit, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. It is unclean for you. And the pig, though it has a divided hoof, does not chew the cud. It is unclean for you. So Abram had to be holy in worship, but also holy in standard of living. He had to be set apart. Israel had to be set apart from the other nations in how they lived. Chewing cud is good because it's grass and plants and wheat. The animals are eating proper nutrients from the earth. So that's where the chewing the cud comes from. Anything else might be a bit more dangerous. That's why the pig is dangerous, because pigs don't necessarily eat grass and chew cud. They eat all kinds of other rubbish. And I can't use the word that I want to use now. But they eat a whole lot of bull. Pigs rarely eat C-A-R-P with a C-A-R-P with a R the other way around, that one. But you just toss anything there and they chow it. So it's a very practical application here. Eating cud is healthy. Eating other things was not. Undivided hooves or uncloven hooves, biologically, they mean the animal is more durable and can travel long distances. So animals that didn't have a divided hoof, like the camel, though it chews the cud, does not have a divided hoof. Animals like that were more durable. And so if people were eating their camels, how are they going to get anywhere? Camels were a big mode of transport back then. I mean, to make the journey from Egypt to Israel, they must have had some kind of animal for transportation. So if they started eating their camels, what would they have? There's a practicality behind that. As well with dassies or hyraxes and hares, they're rodents. They're full of diseases. They carry parasites. So all of this wasn't for nothing. They had to be holy in their worship, but also in their standard of living. God calls us to a better life. When I say God's got a better plan for you, it's a better way of living. When we're not being selfish, when we're not being proud and arrogant, when we're not trying to compete with the next person and be better than them, we're actually happy. We've got joy. We're healthy. We're not stressing about everything. And so we need, like I said, Abram was called to be holy in his worship and in his living, Israel as well. That applies to us still today. When God calls us to be holy, we need to live holy lives, separate lives from the world. And that includes practical things as well. In addition to his grace, God's requirement for obedience and holiness is evident here. So he pulled them out, but obedience and holiness, it's all evident there. Then the third aspect, last aspect I want to look at is the geography. I call it the geography, but it's more just how things happened, If we have a look at the land, what was happening in the land, the context is maybe a better word. We read that Abram took his wife, which must have been quite an interesting ordeal. It's quite a thing if I want to go to Spa at the wrong time of the day, because then we need to get our shoes on and make sure that the hair's done. Now Abram knows he needs to move, and he needs to tell his wife to pack everything up. But not only his wife, his nephew, took his nephew Lot, his family, all the people they had acquired, all their possessions. This was a big thing. This is not just Abram getting up and going to the promised land. It's him doing a complete, what's it called? Verhuis, is that the right word? I like that word in Afrikaans. It's like verhuis, you're moving your house, everything's going. It was a big thing. It must have been a big caravan of donkeys, people, animal, carts, everything. It was a big band of people, not just a small family. And I think that was because it must have been an intimidation for the Canaanites. Must have been, because we read that the Canaanites were still living in the land. But I also think it was a mighty proclamation of God giving the land to Abram. This great big band of people moving through the land, with the inhabitants still living there watching this. This was a mighty proclamation. This was God saying, this is going to be my chosen people, and this is the land that I'm going to give to them forever. But on a practical level, they also needed lots of resources to survive. Abram needed everything. He couldn't leave anything there. It wasn't like an investment. He's got a property somewhere else he could go back to on holidays. And when he's got some time off and go visit family over there, he wasn't going to leave anything behind. God told him to go. So he went. How many of us, when God tells us to go somewhere, we go? Maybe not as big as moving to another place. But that person you need to be talking to. That friend that you should have invited to evening service tonight that you didn't because you got a little bit scared. When God tells you to go, you go. Like Abraham went. So obedience, number one. But secondly, there's always a practical level. Better standard of living. He needed resources to survive. When God tells us to go, we need to be obedient because that's holy in worship. But He's got a better plan for us. So when we go, it's because there's something better there. Even if it doesn't feel like it straight away, it's because there is something better there, because God knows more than us. Like I said, the Canaanites were still living in the land. Moses makes it very clear when he writes that here. And that's powerful, the Hebrew readers, because they can see God's mighty handiwork through the scriptures. They were living in the land at the stage when they would have been reading this. And so they can see how God called Abram, how God pulled him out from the pagan world, and how God sent him with everything he had into the promised land. How Abram died, and before he died, he was blessed miraculously with a son, and how that son had two sons, and Esau and Jacob, and then Jacob had 12 sons, how they went to Egypt, how they came back. The Hebrews, this would have been powerful for them to follow this whole progression, this how the events unfolded. And especially things like the Canaanites were still living in the land. They wiped them out. When Joshua went in to conquest the land and conquer it, they were told to wipe everybody out there because that was their land. But we'll get to that when we look at that. To me, the greatest significance in all of this is that Abram built an altar. We read, when he arrived, the first thing he did was build an altar to the Lord. The first thing he did when he got to land and pitched his tent was build an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. To the Lord who had appealed to him. This promised land, Israel, the nation of Israel, would be God's dwelling place among men. So I take back what I said. I said the first point was the most significant. This is now the most significant, if you forget everything else. Israel was to be God's dwelling place among men. And we know that ultimately that has been fulfilled through the person of Jesus Christ, who came from Israel, who came from the Jews, who grafted the Gentiles into God's family, and who gave us the Holy Spirit, that now God dwells in us and amongst us. And we see God confirming this all throughout the story of Israel. In Exodus 29:45, he says, I will dwell among the sons of Israel, and I will be their God. I will dwell among the sons of Israel and will be their God. Why would he be saying this if he wasn't going to stay with them? We know when they moved the tabernacle and when they built the temple, there was I think there was a big cloud. And when God was guiding them, he also had a big cloud through the desert. And this was a mighty demonstration. On the mountain, when he gave Mount Sinai, when he gave Moses the law, the very thing that would create them into a nation, they were all like shaking and scared because of his mighty presence. So Israel was to be God's dwelling place among men, and he made that very, very evident, as we shall see. To Abram built an altar. Abram built an altar because he knew that God was with him and directing his paths. And he confirms this through the prophets. In Ezekiel we read, my dwelling place will also be with them. I'll be their God. They will be my people. So here we see, I'll be their God. They'll be my people. We have seen that before as well, as we shall see. But I will be their God. and they will be my people. There is a relationship here. God wasn't just going to live amongst Israel. Israel wasn't going to be just his dwelling place. They were going to be his children. They were going to be his people. There was going to be a covenant relationship. That was what the plan was. Zechariah reads, "Sing for joy and be glad, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I am coming, and I will dwell in your midst, declares the Lord." Sing for joy and be glad. I am coming, and I will dwell in your midst. Isaiah 7:14, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel." What does Emmanuel mean? God with us. God with us. We cannot ignore where Jesus comes from. We cannot ignore the significance of the nation of Israel. We found initially it was in the tabernacle and the temple, like I mentioned, and ultimately through Jesus Christ. I also think Abram's wealth was a foreshadow for Israel, especially the temple's prosperity and magnificence, if they obeyed and dwelt in the land. Like I said, they'd be prosperous if they obeyed and dwelt in the land. And that was Abram moving with his big caravan into the land. That was the kind of pomp and ceremony and magnificence and prosperity and wealth and all these wonderful, nice things that Israel would have, just like Abram had. He was a very, very rich man. He became even richer. And that was what they would have if they obeyed and dwelt in the land. Dwelling means inhabiting fully. So to inhabit fully, they had to remove all pagan influence. They had to work the land. They had to enjoy the land. And all of that. We shall see in Joshua that they left one of the pagan tribes. They left them behind. So already it starts badly there. Well, it started badly with them complaining and worshipping the calf. But it kind of got better before Joshua went in. Then he went in and had this wonderful campaign. But then they left a couple of people that they weren't supposed to leave. So that wasn't dwelling in the land. But the point is that God told Abram to dwell in the land. And dwelling means inhabiting fully, enjoying it, working it, being there. Are we dwelling in the land? Not the promised land, as in Israel, but where we are. We know that God is amongst us where we are now. We know that our land is the kingdom of God. We are citizens of heaven. And so, are we dwelling in the land, or are we always looking for a way out? So to conclude, Abram, in person of Abram, if we look at the connections, Israel was called out of the world. We can almost say the exalted nation. Why was Abram called the exalted father? Because he was above other nations. God chose him through whom he would make a nation that was exalted and above every other nation. If we look at the blessings, we see that Israel was to be a blessed nation spiritually and physically or practically. So remember, when God called Abram, he had to be holy in his worship, but also holy in how he lived. So Israel was to be a blessed nation spiritually and physically, a holy and distinguished people, both in worship and amongst the nations. And lastly, if we look at the geography, the context, Israel was to be the place of God's dwelling among men. Israel was to be God's dwelling among men. So how is this significant to us? Well, I've gone through how it is significant to us. We aren't Israel. This is a very specific people in the Old Testament. But we do know that we've been grafted into the blessings that God promised to Abram. Not necessarily the land and all that, but in salvation, through Jesus, in grace, in Him living in us, in Him directing our paths, in Him choosing us, calling us by name. We have been grafted in. But we still need to remember that there is a separate nation, ancient nation of Israel, through whom God would carry out His redemption plan for the world. And although they disobeyed and things went very wrong, It never really ended. The only time Israel was what they were supposed to be, kind of, was the United Kingdom under David. Started with Saul, but ultimately under David's reign. But God still carried out his plans through them. God still gave us the Messiah through them. Us Gentiles, I don't think anybody's Jewish here, us Gentiles had a plan of salvation. Had a way to God pulling us out of the pagan world, pulling us from our sin. And it all started with the nation of Israel. Not because they were obedient, because we know they were very disobedient. They even got exiled. They got destroyed. If you were following my exposition on the Olivet Discourse and agree with me, you will see that God's wrath was poured out against them in 70 AD when the Romans came and destroyed the temple, and that kind of sent them packing. But because of God's goodness, his plans and purposes were still carried out through them. And that's like I said last week. If you call yourself a believer, if you give yourself that tag, God's still going to work through you because he's sovereign. And if we don't give into that, if we don't submit to him and surrender to him, we're going to crumble because we're going to try to fight it. God's plans and purposes are always going to be fulfilled. Not because of you, not because of me, not because of anything else, but because of who he is. Because of his greatness, because of his glory, because of his character. And that's the wonderful assurance we have every single day of our lives. God's plans and purposes are always going to be carried out because of him, because he has decided that they will. Amen. So as we carry on with the nation of Israel, I want to encourage you, let's think of it from an ancient Hebrew perspective and try to understand it from that. But at the same time, see how God's mighty hand is working through this nation and enabled us to be where we are today, saved and carried by the grace of Jesus.